Okay, good morning. You ready? There you go. Slowly, quiet enters the room and economics fills the void. How exciting. All right, I'm back. You ready? How was Kyle? He's good? Yeah, he wrote an amazing dissertation. I'm a big fan of his work. That guy's going to change the world or part of it. Very important. He works on rice and submergence tolerance rice. So this is really cool stuff. One of the big issues in rural India is there's a lot of farmers who still subsistence farm, grow in these really low yield environments. And one of the big things is rice hates it if you have too little water and if you have too much water. So as soon as water covers the entire rice plant, often the plants die, seedlings die, and yields are really, really low. So we've been working on, well, not we, humanity has been working on trying to come up with varieties of rice that deal better with being fully submerged. So IRRI, which is an organization in the Philippines, came up with this type of rice that's submergence tolerant. So Kyle ran a randomized control trial that showed that these rice seedlings actually do much, much better even in the field. So if you have submergence, yields are higher. If you don't have submergence, yields are the same as with regular rice seeds. So this is pretty exciting. That means you do better when things are bad and you don't do worse when things are good. So it's a win-win. Then you look at farmer behavior and look at how do farmers change their behavior once they know that they have these better seeds, and farmers turn out to do all the right stuff, invest more in fertilizer and other things that even further boost yields. And then he ran this experiment to try and figure out how to get this seed to the people, different ways of getting the stuff to people, either through social networks in rural villages or by sending essentially salespeople around from house to house and figuring which way is best. What do you think does better, social networks or somebody knocking on your door? Yeah, that's what you would think, right? Your social networks don't stand a chance against a good salesperson. So it turns out the person going door to door actually did much better. So this is an oversimplified version of 5 years of Kyle's life. He's got 4 other papers. The guy's going to go far. So when you come back 10 years down the road, when you're rich and famous and we ask you for money because we'll need it, I'll tell you what Kyle has done over the past 10 years and I'll sell it as a Berkeley thing and then we'll ask you for a check. How's that? I'm just joking. I won't ask you for a check. That'll be the fundraising office. All right, back to economics. So what have we talked about? We've talked about a lot, right? We are at an exciting place in this course. We're about to leave the boring part. So what we now know is we know how firms behave, right? We know how firms choose their optimal output, right? They set quantity where price is equal to marginal cost if they're a competitive firm, or if they're a non-competitive firm, as we'll see, they'll set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. If price is higher than minimum average variable cost they produce, if it's lower, they shut down. So what that gave us is that gave us a short-run competitive supply curve, which if you add it up horizontally across firm, you get the aggregate market supply curve. In the long run, the mechanisms are fairly similar in terms of going from a single firm supply curve to an aggregate supply curve, but the big difference between increasing market output in the long run versus in the short run is what? Anybody? I like it. That's right. So in the long run, firms can enter and exit. In the short run, the number of firms is fixed, right? Because we're assuming that you need capital in order to start operations. So in the long run, you can increase market output by having firms enter, or having individual firms produce more. In the short run, the only way to increase output is to have existing firms produce more. So what Kyle showed you last time is a couple of different scenarios what the long run supply curve looks like. And the most sort of standard model that you see is one where you have free entry and exit, you have a whole bunch of identical firms, and you have constant costs. The long run supply curve is a nice flat horizontal line. Then if you have heterogeneous firms that are capacity constrained, what you'll see is that low-cost firms enter first until they run out of capacity. Then the second lowest cost firm enters third lowest cost, fourth lowest cost, fifth lowest cost. So you get this nice step function, upward sloping supply curve. So that was the long-run supply, which gets us to market equilibrium. Right? Market equilibrium is essentially what we said in the first 15 seconds of this lecture, of this show, course. High level of entertainment here. But the point is what we tried to get to is this model that even your grandma understands. Right? I mean, your grandmas are very smart ladies because they sent you to cow. But the point here is right? This market demand equals supply. Actually, the right way of saying is quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So what we need is a market supply curve, which we've derived. What we also need is a market demand curve. Well, we know how to derive individuals' demand curves. If we add them up horizontally across individuals, we get the market demand curve. And equilibrium is simply putting the market demand curve and the market supply curve in one picture, and where they cross, that's what we call equilibrium. Equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So this is where we are. Now, excitement ensues. Are you ready? I tried to be sort of hip. You see how I didn't censor it? I put it in the bottom right of the slide. It was my desperate attempt at, I don't know. Like I like those T-shirts the Roots drummer, what's his name, Questlove wears? He always has great T-shirts. So this is my attempt at one of those T-shirts. I'm just joking. Pathetic, Max. You may. You need some glasses? There's a couple here, too. All right. Somebody left their glasses there right here. Okay. So what we're going to do now for the rest of this class, essentially, is we're going to apply this model that we've painstakingly developed. So what we're going to try and figure out is, what happens if the market's perfectly competitive? How well off is society? What if the market is not perfectly competitive? If we leave the market alone, what will be its optimal price and quantity combination? And does that make us better or worse off than in the perfectly competitive outcome? So we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to look at monopoly, oligopoly, public goods, externality, monopolistic competition, asymmetric information, and I'm sure, choice under uncertainty, general equilibrium. I mean, we're going to look at so many things that will be so exciting, and on your final exam, you will be so happy when this class is over. All right? But the point here is, Max, you just said something, and that something sort of bothers me, is that you're going to tell me something about how well off we are, right? Who is we? And what does, I hate this, the camera stopped doing that. Who is we, and what do you mean by well off, right? So we've talked about the concept of happiness or how well off we are as individuals, and we used a concept known as utility to measure the happiness of the individual. Well, utility, which was our measure of well-being of the individual, was a very useful concept when we tried to derive indifference curves and how people substitute between goods and in order to derive demand curves and angle curves. But what did I say about utility across individuals? If I'm currently at a level of utility of 5 utils, right, and Fiona's level of happiness is 10 utils, is Fiona happier than I am? Maybe. We have no idea, right? Utility is a ranking. It doesn't compare across individuals. It allows one individual to rank different consumption bundles. But because my number of utils is higher than your number of utils, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily happier than you are. So you can't compare utility across individual. That also means I can't add up utils across individuals and come up with a sum of utils across individuals as my measure of social welfare. Well, Max, that's kind of depressing. I thought you promised boredom and no more boring concepts. Well, I lied. I've lied to you before, and I will lie to you again, all right? On tape, digitally, all right? So utility is a bad measure of welfare because it's not comparable across individuals. So if we want to figure out how well off a society is, I somehow have to figure out a measure that adds up well-being across individuals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with something totally new. You've seen it before in your intro to econ class 12 years ago, and it's going to be called consumer surplus, all right? Let me try and motivate it a little bit more for a second, and then we're going to draw lots of consumer surplus pictures. So, bless you. I'm going to prepay a couple of bless yous. Allergies are rampant. Usually I congratulate you on your sneezes, but it's just there's too much sneezing going on, so I assume I said bless you. So utility is a bad measure of welfare. Can't compare it across individuals, and even if you could, you don't even know your own utility function. So if President Obama came down or he sent you the Office of Management and Budget in order to figure out what aggregate utility is, and they asked you for your utility function, you couldn't write it down, right? It's defined over every possible good, over every possible amount of goods, and in order for you to write down a mathematical expression that's correct and defined over all goods, it's just not a feasible exercise. So what are we going to do, Max? We're going to come up with this stuff called consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is pretty awesome. All right, so I was in Shanghai last week. It was amazing. What a city. 20 million people. And if you go every 6 months, it looks totally different every 6 months. There's a lot going on in Shanghai. But so I taught my class on Wednesday. I got on my United flight. It was pretty much really bumpy from all the way from Alaska to the southern tip of Japan, which is a long way. I don't deal well with turbulence. If you've ever flown United Economy, their service offerings are not fantastic. So by the time I got to Shanghai and I made it from the airport into my hotel, I was really thirsty, really thirsty. Drinking alcohol is a really bad idea against jet lag, but I really wanted a big bucket of green tea. So I walk into the hotel bar and I say, I would love a bucket of green tea. I get the raised eyebrow. Really, in a bar? Okay, we'll make you some green tea. What do you think my willingness to pay was for that bucket of green tea? You think it was a lot? I'm well paid, right? I make a good amount of money. I'm happy. I'm not complaining. Not as much as a consultant, but I'm okay. I would have handed over $50 for a pot of hot tea. Easy. I was thirsty. The caffeine, the antioxidants, it would have made me feel so good. Guess how much I paid for my bucket of green tea? Shanghai isn't cheap. I paid about, $8, which is good for a bucket of tea. So what happened there? My marginal willingness to pay was $50, but I paid $8 for it. So what did I just get for free? $42 of happiness, right? My willingness to pay there was $42 over what I actually had to pay. So I drank my liter, because China is metric, as any decent country should be, right? So I drank my liter of tea, insert your favorite Super Troopers joke, and I wanted to order another liter of tea. How much after my liter of green tea do you think my willingness to pay was for that second liter of green tea? Yeah, maybe 8, maybe 20, less than 50 though, right? So I would have put it at 20. Again, I would have had to pay $8 for it, so I would have gone home with 12. If my marginal willingness to pay would have been 8, which of course depends on my preferences, then I would have been indifferent between consuming that liter of green tea or not, right? But I get $0 of consumer surplus from that last unit. So this is exactly what consumer surplus is, right? It's a measure of welfare. It is the one we use a lot, and it is motivated exactly in the way I've just explained it. You can argue that you don't like it, right? You may have a better measure, but it's the one we're going to use, all right? So, and it's the one actually that everybody uses. It's the one we use when we do welfare calculations for new policies. It's regulatorily the popular measure, and hence, it's important. So even if you don't like it, you have to know it. So the nice thing about this is the demand curve contains all the information I need, right? So what the demand curve tells me is for each additional unit, how much am I willing to pay for that additional unit, right? For the first unit, as your demand curve is downward sloping, I'm willing to pay a lot. For the second unit, I'm willing to pay a little bit less. For the third unit, I'm willing to pay a little bit less. So as you increase quantity demanded, your marginal willingness to pay, how much you're willing to pay for that additional unit, simply decreases. If we assume that you have a constant price that you face, that also means for each additional unit consumed, the amount of consumer surplus you get goes down, right? Because your marginal willingness to pay goes down, the price stays constant. For each additional unit, you get less. So let's draw this. Simple example here. I use beer. I tried to step away from beer, right? But yeah. Okay. Let's try the following, all right? So what we have on the x-axis here is dollars, on the y-axis dollars, on the x-axis pints. Pints of beer. Terrible handwriting. This does not say pants. This says pints, all right? So what I'm going to draw you is my marginal willingness to pay for pints of beer, or as we've called it in the past, my demand curve. So here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so for the first unit, I'm willing to pay 5. For the second unit, 4. For the third unit, 3. For the fourth unit, 2. That should say 4. Come on. There we go. 4. And for the fifth unit, 1. Okay, so I'm just going to connect these here. Just for simplicity's sake, I drew this as a stepwise function, right? You could also draw it as a straight line like the demand curves we usually see, but then I have to calculate sort of triangles, and I don't want to calculate the area of triangles right now because that involves division, and that's hard, right? So I'm going to assume that in this particular market, this is definitely not Berkeley, okay? But in this market, what we're going to assume is that beer costs $2 a pint. Why do you hate me again, Surface? We got along so well. Really? You're questioning it? I'm questioning it too. I'm trying. Glass half full, all right? Okay. This here is the competitive price. Is $2, all right? Guy walks into a bar, is really thirsty, and a pint costs $2. That's exactly true nowhere. But the point is what this person gets, right? For the first unit, his marginal willingness to pay is $5. He or she only has to pay $2 for it. So for that first unit, that individual gets 1, to $3 of consumer surplus. So I'm going to write this in here. We're going to come up with $1 chunks of consumer surplus. So for the first unit, 1, 2, 3. It's the distance between his demand curve and the price he paid for it. For the second unit, his marginal willingness to pay is $4. Price is $2. So of course he's going to consume that second unit. So he gets another $2 of consumer surplus. Third unit, willingness to pay is $3. Price is still $2. So the distance between the demand curve and price is $1. The fourth unit is the scenario we had earlier with the 8 and 8, only here it's 2 and 2. The beer is $2. His willingness to pay is $2, so he's sort of indifferent. That's the point where you're sitting there and you're like, I could have another one or not. You're looking at the TV and wondering where the football game is at, and you decide whether you're going to have the other one or not. But you're not going to get any additional consumer surplus. So this individual here is going to consume $3 or $4, 3 or 4 units. Doesn't really matter for our surplus calculations, and gets how much consumer surplus. So just add up all the nice pizza slices at a square, Sicilian, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, $6 of consumer surplus. So why do we like this? Why is consumer surplus preferred to utility? What are the units of consumer surplus? Dollars. So if you go home, I don't know, I used to teach this class in the fall. I could talk about Thanksgiving, but there's a variety of possible holidays that few people go home for in the spring break. If you go home for the holidays and you say, I went to a bar and I got 60 utils out of my 3 beers, your family is going to pull you out of Berkeley and say you're learning useless stuff. But if you come home and you say, I went and I got $6 of consumer surplus from consumption of whatever good you had, people can relate to the units, right? So if you're trying to evaluate policies, for example, and you're trying to figure out what consumer surplus losses or gains are from, let's say, a fuel efficiency regulation or an air quality regulation, if you measure consumer welfare or consumer surplus changes in dollars, that's something we know the magnitude of and we can compare to other quantities in the economy that matter, all right? So this is the consumer surplus for one individual. In equilibrium here, this individual has $6 of consumer surplus. So if we look at this for the market, if you add up all individuals who are consuming their pints of beer in the Berkeley market for pints, you add up demand curves across all individuals, and you figure out what the area under the demand curve is for all individuals, that's aggregate consumer surplus. So the way you figure out what aggregate consumer surplus is in a market is pretty straightforward. All right, what you do is you look at the market demand curve. So this is demand, market demand. All right, if equilibrium price is, let's say, right here, then consumer surplus for all people in the market is simply the area under the demand curve above market price over the range of consumption. Okay? Those three, well, that sentence you're going to hear about 1,000 more times because we're going to do this a lot. So let's do this again. Consumer surplus is going to be the area under demand above price over the range of consumption. All right? So same thing, if you go to the picture that we just drew before, the same thing was true here. Right? Consumer surplus is the area under demand above price over the range of consumption here. That's the Sicilian pizza slices up here. If we do this for the market, you just take the aggregate demand curve, which is the horizontal sum of the individual's demand curves, and you look for the area under the demand curve above price over the range of consumption. So consumer surplus here is going to be this area right here. Equilibrium quantity, of course, is going to be this quantity right here. All right? So consumer surplus is going to be our measure of how well off consumers are from a certain price-quantity combination in a market. Well, Max, that's nice. I like consumers. Consumers are cool. But what about the other guys, right? What about producers? Actually, sorry, I came up with this really cool exercise. Let's try this one before we get to producers. So what happens if price changes to consumer surplus? What if price, for some reason that we're not going to discuss now, but we'll have lots of scenarios where there'll be specific reasons for price changes. What if price changes? What happens to consumer surplus? Well, let's look at that for a second. I'm going to make this really complicated because these are going to be complicated. Price, quantity. Okay, we're in a market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for, I want this point right here. Okay. Sorry, this is a little bit tough to draw. I'm nervous. There we go. Demand curve 1, and now I'm going to draw a second demand curve here. Demand curve. Come on, ruler, don't let me down. Here we go. Okay, this one here I'm going to call demand curve 1. This one here I'm going to call demand curve 2. They both go through this point here, which is going to be 2, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? This is one demand curve. This is the other one. Which one's the more price-elastic demand curve? D2, right? Easy question, right? Price changes a little bit. You get a lot more action on quantity on D2 than you do on D1. So D2 is the more elastic demand curve. Now I'm going to pick a price, and then I'm going to let price increase, okay? So I'm going to pick this price right here, 5. Ooh, terrible. And let's do this in red. Okay, at that price, under both demand curves, the equilibrium quantity is 5. The equilibrium price is 5. Equilibrium quantity is 2. Okay, that's the first price. So we could call this P star. Now I'm going to let price increase a little bit. Okay, this is the higher price, so let's call this P double star. It's like 575 or something like that. And what I want to do is I want to compare consumer surplus